Okay. Welcome to the Bronx African American History Project. My name is Steven Payne, librarian and archivist at the Bronx County Historical Society, and I'm here with Paul Rosenblum, better known to friends as Pete, who grew up in the Bronx and has had a fascinating life full of many, many experiences, and we're excited that he's taken the time today to shed light on some of these. So we begin these oral history interviews by asking, Pete, why don't you tell us a little bit about your family and how they ended up in the Bronx?
My parents were immigrants from Russian-controlled Poland, and after the Russian Revolution, both of them ended up in the United States. And my father got here via Brazil, so we used to tease him that he was a Brazilian. My brother and I have a younger brother. And both of them, when they came to the United States about 1920, they ended up in the garment industry. And I'm not sure how they met, but at that time in the 1920s and 30s, the New York City garment industry was a predominant, was powered by immigrants.
Sure.
Jewish and Italians mainly. After they met, I gathered there was those immigrants in the Lower East Side. They lived in the Lower East Side, but after they met and married, they moved to Brooklyn, and I was born in Unity Hospital in Brooklyn on March 5th, 1927. So I'm now about 93 and a half.
Young spring chick, huh?
Yes, yeah. Looking for a cougar. But anyway, I got from my father a sense of humor, which my brother and many of our siblings, the kids do have. But I found out as time went by that they had both used to go to Sacco and Vanzetti rallies, so they both were leftists.
Wow.
I found out everything gradually. I didn't know it when we moved into the Bronx when I was about 2 years old, and I gathered that they lived in a building about 2 blocks from the Coops, and then they moved into the Coops when I was about two or three. I think the big thing that happened in my life is that I had congenital cataracts, and I had to have a cataract operation when I was 3 years old, and I wore glasses ever since then.
Oh, wow.
So that's been one of the big factors in my life besides growing up in the Coops.
Sure. Do you remember which apartment you all had in the Coops?
Well, yeah, I moved, but the first one that I remember was in E22 in the first section, and my mother's brother, his wife, and his son, we all lived in the same apartment. Then my uncle had a daughter, so that there were 7 of us living in that apartment. My brother wasn't born till after I was 9 years old, when I don't believe I was living in that apartment anymore.
Sure.
But for the first part of my life, that was the big apartment. Eventually, my uncle and aunt moved out, and we must have moved to another place. But I was, I just did whatever my mother said. She liked to move. She liked the view from there because she could see Bronx Park and the auditorium of the Coops. Was right outside our. Plus, on top of me, there was a young woman who was playing the piano all the time. She grew up and became a pianist and lived in Caracas, Venezuela. But that was information that I gathered in the course of the 93 years that I've been alive.
Sure. Which floor was that apartment on?
It was the second floor. The first floor is the ground floor, and all the 20, it's the second floor, then it was 30, 40, and 50. It was a 5-story building. The Coops was, you know, a whole, what is the Tudor style, I think is what it was.
Tudor style, yeah.
Yeah, you have pictures of it yet?
And no elevator, of course.
No, I learned later that according to the law in New York City, from about 1900, all buildings above 5 stories had to have elevators. But no, they didn't.
Just missed it then.
So that was from the tenement laws. I've learned a lot of things in these 90 years.
I'm sure.
I didn't know it when I was a kid.
You weren't as wise, although maybe you were a wise guy, huh?
It accumulated a lot of information. And as I tell my friends, I'm living in nostalgia, remembering things like the ivy covered. The Coops were a red brick building with ivy.
Sure.
And eventually they had to pull down the ivy because it was weakening the bricks.
Oh yeah, it's very persistent stuff. The ivy is, isn't it?
Kind of stuff that I picked up over the years.
Yeah.
In terms of what was happening was that because the Coops opened in 27, and most of the people who moved in were immigrants, I would say 95% were Jewish. Most of those were garment workers. And so that the composition of the Coops at the beginning was very, proletarian oriented.
Sure.
Very proud of being left-wing proletarians and Jewish.
Absolutely.
And that was the basis for building it. It was called the Workers Cooperative Colony. It was one of 4 co-ops built in the Bronx in the 1920s when there was a very strong cooperative movement in the United States, symbolized by twin trees. But the Coops itself, as far as I could understand, we had all these young couples and had a population in 750 apartments on 2 square blocks.
Yeah, wow.
An approximate population of 3,000. And most of the families that moved in had children a little older than me. And then after my cohort, the number of kids that, lessened and lessened. By the time that my brother was 9 years old in 1936, who had 150 to 200 kids, to play with, my brother had a much lower number of children to play with.
I see, yeah.
So it was a very youth-oriented place. And with these young couples, they wanted to do the best they could for the young kids.
Sure.
And what they did, they set up a library. Of course, there was no library anywhere except in Fordham Road on the other side of Bronx Park. We were on Bronx Park East.
Yeah.
And they also set up a kindergarten for the children of working parents.
Sure.
Or, if the mothers had to work. So that it was one of the first kindergartens set up for children. The other 3 co-ops were all sort of left-wing and Jewish, including the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union set up a big co-op that was even bigger than ours, but they had more money.
Yeah.
And still in existence. The others, I don't believe are co-ops anymore. There were Sholem Aleichem houses and another one that I can't remember right now.
Barbond.
It's all, well.
I think that's the name of it, though.
Keeps changing.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
But in terms of, I can tell you about the Coops, which from the view of a little kid growing up, and I should, because the population was so heavily Jewish and left-wing, the first knowledge I had of anything to do with African Americans was the Scottsboro Boys, and I must have been 6 or 7 years old when I heard about them.
Sure.
Later on, the other kids, the older boys, set up social and athletic clubs, and they named a couple of them after some of the Scottsboro Boys. And since, when you first raised the question with me, I try to trace back my consciousness of African Americans in the country and in the city. And
Sure.
by coincidence, I just finished listening to a major book about the Great Migration from the South during the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, when about 4 million African Americans moved to the North and the West and New York City.
Sure.
So I have a big picture of the whole thing. As far as myself and the Coops, the biggest thing I remember in terms of African Americans was the Max Schmeling, Joe Louis fight in 1937, when Joe Louis knocked the hell out of a Nazi. We were very conscious of the Nazis. And there was a big celebration in the Coops and in Harlem. The next thing in my consciousness, now in 1937, I'm 10 years old. 1939, my uncle, who at that time owned a small retail bakery, told me that someone had left a record, a phonograph record in his store that I wanted. So I said, yeah, I'll take it home.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't even understand at first that it was about lynching.
Sure.
But I must have learned pretty soon after that. So those were the major influences in my knowledge of African Americans.
Sure.
I wasn't conscious of having any African American friends. I played there was a playground across the street from us. I played a lot of handball, I played other sports, but I don't remember any African American or Black kids playing with me. But as I contacted the 2 or 3, 4 people that are still around to ask them about their memories, they also had the same memories as I, that they didn't play with the few African American kids that are around.
Sure.
We know their names, or some of their names. There was Charlie and Herb Dubois. There was one African American woman named Angie Dickinson. Absolutely. She used to have parties and card playing in her apartment, but I was too young to go to it. The only people I knew who went to it was my friend Boris, who was 2 or 3 years older than me. And at one of them, later on, he met the woman he married, Libby. So that was one. There was some interracial couples which I gradually became aware of in the Coops. And there was one outstanding guy named Bill Taylor, who was a major in the Air Force, who I got to know after the Second World War.
Okay, I see.
So, and he ended up working in a print shop owned by one of the tenants of the Coops, a guy named Berg, and some other people also worked for him. But it wasn't until after the Second War, maybe during the war, I have to understand that I left the Coops to go to Cornell in 1945. And so I was coming back and forth and, seeing my old friends who were mostly Jewish. There were a couple of Ukrainians, a few Italians, but I didn't know too many of the other, Coop African-American kids. There was a guy named Mikey who was going out with the sister of one of the younger friends I had. And when I was talking to these other people who grew up with me and we still talk about it, I questioned them about their memories, and it was the same as mine.
Sure.
What happened after the Second World War, there were, I have to backtrack. The big political fight, there were two major political fights which are, they're mentioned in the documentary about the Coops at Home in Utopia.
Definitely.
First was the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, which really divided the Coops politically.
Sure.
There were some people that, could not excuse the Soviets first and Stalin for what they did. And there were others who said, well, he's got to do it. And then later on, during the Second World War, you have to go back. During the Second World War, we had price controls, and that had helped maintain the co-op status of the Coops. In 1932, in the middle of the Depression, New York City passed some kind of law, a moratorium on buildings that owed money. So, which the Coops did. They were financially screwed. And so they said you can't change the ownership during that period of the Depression and the Second World War. And so they only had to pay the interest on the stuff that they owed. In the middle of the Second World War, they finally started to lift the OPA restrictions on rent controls. And in the Coops, there was a question that if they raised the rents the co-op agreed to raise the rents on each room by $1, and everybody was working, there was prosperity during the Second World War.
Sure.
That they could pay off the loan that they had been bankrupted by.
Yeah.
There was a series of meetings, and I was like a teenager by then. And we had a situation where in that situation, by that time, because of the accent on youth, and I'm sorry that I haven't written a history of it, but the kindergarten that I mentioned that was set up in the Coops for children of working mothers was succeeded by the New York City Youth Administration, which sent us people to teach us how to dance, to box,
wow,
etc. And the Coops itself hired a youth worker, and we set up the Vanguard Community Center or something like that. I can't even remember it.
Yeah.
Because we had a lot of social and athletic clubs, and the youth worker used to coordinate us and help us get tickets to baseball games, go to swimming pools, and we also had meetings where we discussed the problems that we had as young people. So at one stage, because everybody, this is during the Second World War, most of the older guys and some of the women were went into the service. We lost a lot of people. We had a whole bunch of people who were in the Army.
Sure.
The Coops mothers set up something called the Allerton Mothers Servicemen's Club or something like that, which had published the publications went to everybody from the Coops who was in the service all over the world. And we had become the most patriotic part of the Bronx during the Second World War. After being, looked down on and all of that. So there's a lot of things in my life, that with my sense of humor, I could see stuff. And the other thing, getting back to this youth club, to the Vanguard Center, when they had the meeting on raising the rents to maintain the co-op, most people seemed to be against raising it. They weren't as militant as they had been when they moved in. And of course they had a lot of other experiences. So one of my dearest friends who, oh my God, he got up to speak on behalf of the youth. And when he started to say to all these, I don't know how many hundred people were sitting in the auditorium, but it was crowded. And when he started to say he wanted them to raise the $1 a month rent, he got a negative reaction. And he didn't know what to do. He got so angry. He always had a short temper. He turned around and sort of mooned the audience for booing him. So he didn't take his pants down, because I'm sure his mother and father were in the audience. So I was called on. I was a peaceful sort of guy to get up and apologize for him. So that was an out. This is the way a young person, I was 15 or 16 years old, I saw politics from the Coops, from a different angle. Now, getting back to the number of people that came from the African American community into the Coops, what happened was that the people who were in the leadership of the Tenants Association, which kept control of the Coops, even though the BX Corporation now owned it. And so they were very left at that time, or their leadership was, it usually was that way, even though the number of socialists, communists, and I can't remember all, different factions, the left movement always had a lot of factions, like every other movement.
Yeah, still does today.
Still today. And so the communists who at that time were there had been a change in the Communist Party during the war or after the war, where they had set up under a guy named Earl Browder, who ran for president for them in 1936. He didn't get many votes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they changed from being a political association. They were criticized by the international communists, a guy named Duclos in France, and they threw Browder out and put in an old-time, really hard-left guy named Forster.
That's right.
And the reaction was that they had to get more militant amongst the Black population of the United States. And so it became an issue, sort of getting, since there was such a housing shortage after the Second World War, guys were coming back, they got married, they had to move into their wife's house or vice versa. And so there was a big shortage of people who wanted to live in the Coops. And the communist influence people said, we gotta integrate this place. But there had been some integration before that.
Sure.
So there was a big fight about who could get the next empty apartment. And I was single. It didn't bother me. I was
Yeah.
living at home. My mother kept moving us to different apartments. She liked the view. She always was that way. I inherited that from her. So now it became a big issue, and there were more blacks who were allowed into the coops or moved into the coops. And it was a big political issue about, what would happen when some of the old timers wanted to move in, move out, move from the top to the bottom, because they couldn't walk up 5 flights anymore. There was a lot of that going on. But I wasn't there to see all of it. And whenever I came back, I heard about it. And some of it, I had become a little more radical as I went to Cornell, where I used to kid around. Cornell is known as the Big Red. And the people I hung around with were the Little Reds. So when I got back, I would hear all this stuff. And one of the there was a black maintenance man named Gary, who was the section leader or something in the party. And as they had their discussions, they came up with the idea of sending some of these old Jewish female communists who had come here from Russia and moved in the coops and were very active in the way the coops was functioning. And by that time, they were 60 or 70 years old. They still spoke with a heavy accent, some of them. And they decided that these women were chauvinists and they had to be sent to school to learn about white chauvinism, which was the most ridiculous thing I could imagine, because they weren't going to change at the age of 60 or 70.
Yeah.
So they never did go, but they were so active and so key to maintaining the tenants association that they never went to the school, the Marxist school that, as I look back on it, was called Jefferson School. And they never mentioned that Jefferson had been a slave owner.
Yeah,
So,
I've been curious about that. I knew the name of it was the Jefferson School for Marxist Studies, I think. It was down.
A Marxist school
Yeah.
down on 16th Street, I think, in 6th Avenue.
That's right. Yeah.
Anyway, these things, as time went by, I realized some of the funny stuff that was going on and around me.
Sure.
There were, different people moved in, but my friends and I, the ones who went off to college all over the country, California, to Purdue, to City College, I went to Cornell, and I think there some of us met some African Americans, but as far as the Coops went, there were very few. My friend Boris, who ended up marrying an African-American woman, and there's a scene in the documentary about his first date with her.
I remember that scene.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness.
So that we were aware of what was going on, but we ourselves, different ones of us didn't, in the Coops, there weren't that many.
Yeah.
So in terms of the question that you had, well, I could only have secondary information, but but it was still a pioneering thing, because it was the first basically white building that did have African Americans in the Bronx, probably in New York City.
Yeah.
There was a lot of discrimination.
And do you remember, did people in the neighborhood get up in arms about the fact that you had a handful of black
No,
people?
I don't remember anything from the neighborhood, because basically During the war, everybody was away. And after the war, the, uh, we had basketball teams that played on Burke Avenue, which was an Italian neighborhood,
Sure.
and later on became controlled by the mafia, so it's peaceful. And beyond that, there was an Irish neighborhood. So our battles during, as teenagers were with gangs who came, what was it? The Fordham Baldies used to come to Pelham Parkway, which was south of us, which was a Jewish neighborhood, but more middle class
Sure.
and working class, and the Coops. And they would call on us to come and fight off the Fordham Baldies, which and also the Irish kids would come down, and once in a while they would have a fight. But we were too poor to have guns.
Of
So
course.
we had stones and pipes, but they weren't very, they were gang fights, but they weren't as a serious nature.
Sure.
But as far as, blacks, not at that time, not right after the war. And I can't tell you because I really basically had moved away by the time I got out of Cornell. And I came back to stay at my parents' home. But later on, I only was in contact with friends of mine, and they were mainly the Jewish friends that I had.
Sure.
Who had, I got together with them. We used to, and also the Jewish kids, a lot of us fell in love with jazz. And I remember I was taken to the Savoy Ballroom by some of the other jazz hounds.
Wow.
And I always remember that the Chick Webb band was the house band, and they used to have other bands come in, and they would have the Battle of the Bands.
Wow.
The day that I went to the Savoy, Dizzy Gillespie was the other band.
Oh my goodness.
Starting to play bebop, and I remembered booing him.
Because it's so unusual to hear if you hadn't heard bebop, to hear bebop the first time.
Crazy. And afterwards, we used to go down during the war. Some of us who were underage, we would get the draft cards of our friends who were in the army, and then we would go to Nick's in the village to hear jazz.
Yeah.
So there was all this interaction.
Sure.
We were very conscious of what was happening. And now that I read this book or heard the book, I understand, the migration was continuing because originally some of the people who set up the Coops had lived in Harlem, and they had a couple of co-op bakeries and stuff like that. But when the Coops was set up in 27, they moved from Harlem into the Coops. So as the Black population up there increased.
Sure.
So these were part of what, I learned as time went by.
Yeah. And so when you moved back in with your parents for a little bit after college, did you start meeting more of the Black tenants at that point, or?
No, I saw them around, and I
Sure.
friends with Bill Taylor. I had gotten involved in the South for a while. I got arrested for vagrancy.
One of the favorite charges.
I was a hero. So people would talk to me a little bit more, but basically, I didn't get to talk to too many people because I was living here and there. I was traveling a lot. I ended up living with a friend of mine in the village who I had become very close to while we were at Cornell, a millionaire.
Wow. Yeah, that's right. And that's how you met. That's how you met your wife, Doris, right?
Yes. But before that, my mother had moved us into the last court in section V23.
Mm.
And above us in V33 was the Rosenstein family. My mother and Mrs. Rosenstein, Toby, were friendly. They knew each other. But Mrs. Rosenstein had 3 boys, big guys, who used to stomp on them. They walked around their apartment on my head. Eventually, one of them became a multi-millionaire
Wow.
and set up something called the Puffin Foundation,
Sure.
which to finance that documentary.
That's right.
And he only died about less than a year ago, but I always could call him and always he knew my Yiddish name. So I always said, I forgive you for all the headaches you and your brothers gave me when I lived underneath you. We used to laugh. We used to have a lot of people from the Coops went different ways, and I have tried to stay over the years as much as I could in touch with them. Later on, I was a pioneer in computers. I was a member of the New York Amateur Computer Club. And later on, I got involved with computers. My brother and I brought a computer to K-Pro. He lived 2 floors below me.
Yeah.
I live now. And the K-Pro, what was it called? You could carry it from floor to floor. It was about as big as a suitcase.
Yeah.
So I brought it over to the elevator, brought it down to him, brought it up here, and I got involved with computers at an early stage of the computers. And then eventually, I ended up going to hacker conventions.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I had a lot of stuff on computers. I learned a lot, but now I can't. I joined about 3 years ago. And so I depend on my daughter to set up Zoom meetings.
Sure. You're doing what you
As you said, I had a very adventurous life.
You did. You have. Yeah.
But getting back to what you wanted, you have any more questions for me?
Oh, you're doing such a good job. It's kind of a natural rhythm to hitting on so many points that I was gonna ask you. I do have a few more specific questions though, if that's all right.
Okay, as long as my memory holds up.
Oh yeah, sure. So after the Coops became a regular rental complex, do you remember any rent strikes that took place?
No, I do remember as a kid when there were rent strikes in some of the buildings around the Coops.
Sure.
And some of the people from the Coops went to help support them. The Coops streets were Allerton Avenue on the south, Barker Avenue on the east, Bronx Park East on the west, and Arno Avenue on the north. Was that the north? I'm confused.
Yeah, I think so.
Anyway, there were other buildings around us, and over the years, different buildings got put up. There were empty lots. As a young person, we had an empty lot, which eventually the city put up a playground in, and there were little ponds in it. When it rained, there was frogs, tadpoles that grew into frogs. People would put old cars in there. There was a lot of junk, not a lot, but that was sort of right across the street from us.
Yeah.
On the other side, on Bronx Park East, there was a greenhouse for a while, right inside the park on the other side of Bronx Park East.
Sure.
And I remember my mother taking me into the park in a baby carriage, and there was like a cherry building, and she would, give me lunch in it, feed me in my baby carriage. So there was a lot of greenery around us, and it helped us, when we were teenagers, we used to go singing and walking in the park, singing songs. So a lot of outdoor activity was
Yeah,
included to
very
us.
beautiful place to grow up.
Yeah, it was a very good place to grow up. And plus it had the political orientation,
Yeah,
uh, which was saying that the young people should be, idolized and respected, but not at a 93.
Now, do you remember?
I still like babies. It's okay.
Do you remember any of the public schools you attended in the Bronx?
Yes, the nearest school, elementary school, was PS 96, which was about 2 blocks. You had to walk on Barker Avenue across Allerton and for 2 blocks, and you came to PS 96. When I was going there, on the east side, there was a vegetable garden, growing there.
Sure.
Later on, there was buildings put up, and it was. I remember thinking it was so big till later on I went. I said, "Oh, how small it was." They had a big backyard. Um, I'm trying to remember. The teachers were Catholic and Jewish, and most of the kids from the Coops, were Jewish and left-wing Jews.
Sure.
And on May Day, some of us carried notes the day before to tell the teacher to excuse us because tomorrow, May Day, is a workers' holiday, so I won't be here. Then we were taken on the subways from Allerton Avenue down to Union Square, wherever they were, and we marched with our father's unions.
Sure.
When we were little, I was on my father's shoulders, and all of us had that experience that were growing up in
Yeah.
the May parades, which were much bigger than they are now. I don't think.
Oh, for sure. Do you remember the Coops having a drum and bugle corps at the
Oh,
parade?
yeah. I'm glad you reminded me. One
Yeah.
big left-wing organizations was called the International Workers Order, and they did insurance and burial
Sure.
benefits. And they had sections from Italian, Jewish, all over the country. I think they must have had 150,000 people.
Yeah.
And in the Coops, they set up a drum and bugle corps, which I wasn't a part of. And they were marching around and they were practicing. And one of my friends, his older sister was the drum majorette.
Oh,
She
wow.
died a few or 2 years ago. And I remember when she was older, she lived in my neighborhood, and I was still see then, and I was sitting with her and her aide, and I told the aide, this Esther used to be the drum majorette. So I said, here, I have a cane. Esther, show Diane how you used to twirl the, and she laughed. She said, yes, I remember. And I married a drummer. So look down, I'm one of the drummers.
I asked about the drum and bugle corps because the other day I spoke with Tommy Warner, and
Oh my God, that name.
he played trumpet in the drum and bugle corps.
Not only that, but after the war, there was a memorial set up in the first court, and which had the names of a lot of the soldiers, that had fought. They didn't have to be dead. And when we had this particular celebration, we had Tommy Warner go up on the roof and play taps or something,
Yeah.
musical on a, from that way. From, so, and then I know that if for a while he worked at, there's a restaurant in the park. They used to Tavern on the Green. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But Tommy was one, he was a kid I knew about, but not that I played with.
He must have been, he was a few years younger than you, or he still is a few years
Yeah,
younger than you, of course.
he was younger than me.
Yeah.
Oh, there was another African American woman named Queen Audley Moore.
Yeah. That was his mom, actually, right?
Who? No.
Yeah, that she was his mother. They had different last names, but
Oh, it could be. I never know who his mother was.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, I knew she, that she lived in the first house. And then I was speaking to one of my friends that's still around, and he said that he lived on the ground floor in the first court, and he said an African-American couple moved in above him, but they never got to know each other too well.
Sure.
He was, I don't know, it must have been after the war, and he
Yeah.
didn't boost too long after that. He, on the GI Bill, he moved out to UCLA to Los Angeles and got married. There's so much stuff, that occurred during that time. And
Yeah.
by coincidence or craziness, I went to the New York State School of Industrial and Labor Relations.
At Cornell.
At that time, it was just opened, and they had something called the Occupational Dictionary of the United States. It was a very thick book, like a big dictionary.
Yeah.
And then after the GI Bill took effect, and all of a sudden, all these people that had, they were going to have careers, they didn't know what careers. They would be salesmen in clothing stores. The whole nature of the United States changed from blue collar to white collar.
Sure.
During that period after the Second World War because of the GI Bill. And I was there watching it happen, understanding, I didn't understand what effects it would have.
Yeah.
I do remember this. Amongst the funnier things was that Cornell and all the Ivy League schools had a tradition that the freshmen wore beanies and the sophomores ordered them around. Told them they had to do this and that and build the fires for the bonfires for the football games. Well, when the freshman beanies guys were all veterans, the sophomores tried to tell them what to do, but they learned that they shouldn't do it. So that the whole tradition went. A lot of things happened during that period after the Second World War inside the United States. And actually, I just remembered when I was going to Cornell, I did meet a couple of African American fellow students. And one of them turned out to be a Republican, which I couldn't understand. And I was actually a member of the NAACP chapter at Cornell.
Okay, I see that.
I've forgotten. I can't remember everything that I did.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very adventurous life, so hard to remember everything. Do you remember Paul Robeson ever coming to the Coops?
Very close, he was rooming with a friend of mine from the Coops, a guy named Jack Minkoff, and another guy, Ken Nash. And Paul Jr. was on the football team. He wanted to imitate his father.
Yeah.
So when I used to go over to visit them, Paul would be banging his head to close the doors, to get. But he was never as good a football player as his father.
Yeah.
Oh boy, but we got to know each other, at that time. This is after I had the Coops.
Sure.
And there's a lot of things that happened that from this guy, Jack Minkoff, had been in the Air Force as a bombardier.
Oh, wow.
And he came up in September of 1945, the same time that I came up. And we walked around looking to find rooms at that time. So I remember, and I always teased him about it later, he was wearing a bombardier's jacket, on the back of which were bombs, of his missions, 20, 30 bombs. And I'm walking with him, and I'm saying, Jack, how come all these co-eds are looking at me? No, they're not.
It's him, huh?
So there were a lot of little things that happened to me, as time went by up at Cornell, and I met people that I had never thought of. And I started off rooming with a young boy from upstate New York. We were sharing a room with a coal furnace, and I never knew how to use it, but he did, and he was in the ag school, and he used to bring back fresh eggs and milk from them. So that Peter Mullen, I forgot his name until this minute.
Wow.
So I met a lot of different, it was a wonderful experience, and that's why when my children grew up, I wanted them to go away to school because
Sure.
it was wonderful for me.
Sure.
And I met all kinds of people, it was just great.
Now, did you happen to be in New York at the time of the Peekskill riots?
No.
Okay, you were already away at that point.
Where the hell was I? I forgot where I was. I've been to a lot of places, but I heard about it. I read about it.
Sure.
And friends of mine, one of the people I spoke to about this interview was there sitting on the stage trying to protect Rosen.
Yeah.
And then this other guy, Boris, who had married an African-American woman, he was there, and he ended up, they pushed him into a bus, which he had never driven before.
That's right.
He just drove on, and he's in the documentary.
That's right. Yeah. Do you through those friends, do you know if there was much of a reaction to the Peekskill riots in the Coops?
Oh yeah, they were waiting for all those people to come back.
Sure.
The big mob waiting for the buses to come back,
Yeah.
About a lot of people from the Coops apparently had gone up there. So, but I wasn't around, when the actual thing happened.
Sure. What about I think you were already away from the Coops by this point as well, but what about the American Labor Party and the Coops? Did it have much of a presence in the Coops?
Yes, they did. On the streets, Bronx Park East, Barker Avenue, Olinville Avenue was the next street.
Sure.
And on the corner of Olinville and Allerton, there were certain stores. There was a drugstore, but on the second floor, there were two giant meeting rooms. This is like in 45, 46. One of them was for the Communist Party. One of them was for the American Labor Party. And they had separate entrances. So you walked up the stairs. So the ALP had a very big presence. And I don't remember the statistics on the votes that they got, but the ALP in the Coops, there were a lot more ALP members than communist members.
Sure, sure.
Liberals, not so much.
Yeah, that was
A
mostly.
lot of Democrats, a lot of Democrats. I don't know how many Republicans were registered from there. I'm trying to remember where the voting was done because I never voted while I was living in the Coops.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure the statistics are around.
Sure.
And then it turned out after when I met my wife, one of my friends, a guy named Bill Newchow, who eventually became the head of the district council of the Teamsters Union, when I introduced him to my wife, he pulled out the Green Book of New York City and he said, oh, she ran for office in 1948 on the ALP ticket in Central Bronx, and the three other parties united against her. She only got about 9,000 votes and she lost. She
Wow.
said, I'll never run for office again. You have to promise too many things to too many people. But I'm not known about that.
Sure.
When I was, courting her and stuff.
Yeah. Angie Dickerson ran on the ALP ticket in 1949.
The Doris, yeah.
Yeah. But she might have been in a different district, and she was running for state senator. I don't remember the
So
district that.
Doris was running in the middle of the Bronx.
That's right. Yeah. So Angie would have been in the district that the Coops
Yeah.
themselves are in. But did you ever meet Vito Marcantonio?
No, but once in a while I went up to his. The people used to go up there to campaign for him, work in his office, but I don't. I might have gone up to see the Lucky Corner or something on 116, but I never personally met him.
Sure.
I just knew about him,
Yeah.
I knew the other guys too, Caccione and
Leo
who
Isaac.
was the guy in Harlem? They were city councilman.
Oh, Ben Davis.
Yeah, but I didn't know them personally. I knew them just celebrities.
For that. Do you remember participating in any interracial demonstrations in the Bronx ever?
No. When Jackie Robinson, when they used to picket Yankee Stadium, I wasn't there with them. There were some people from the Coops that did do that, but I never participated in any of those that I remember now.
Sure.
I wasn't out in the open that much. That I can remember. I didn't get on too many picket lines.
Yeah. And a couple more questions here. Which ways did you stay connected to the Coops in the years after you moved out?
Well, when I moved out, after I met Doris in 55, and so I had to come back to introduce her to my parents and to my friends. And I had been in touch with those people all through the period that I wasn't living. I used to come home to stay with my parents,
Sure.
with my friend Jim Weinstein. And so there were still people that had gotten married, and they would come back to visit their parents too. And one thing that happened on Parker Avenue was after the Second World War, there had barely been any cars. One of my friends, Bert Rosen and his kid brother Fritz, their father owned a little coupe. We used to pack ourselves in to like the clowns in the circus. They would, a whole bunch of clowns would come out, or midgets would come out of a car, and we tried to pack ourselves in because there were no other cars. No one had any cars. Boris's father had a car, a hack, and he used to drive people up to Camp Beacon and Camp Kindleton. But otherwise, after the war, a lot of guys who moved out to the suburbs, including Levittown, they ended up owning cars, and they would drive, and all of a sudden, Barker Avenue, there was no parking. It was just a tremendous change in the car ownership in that area.
Wow.
So before that, before television, the playground on Barker Avenue had benches around it. People used to sit out and listen to the radio on Saturday and Sunday night. And everybody had the same program on. You could sit on the benches and listen to other people's radios. Once TV came in, people didn't sit outside. They sat inside watching television. These were some of the cultural changes that I witnessed.
Sure.
As time went by, as time goes by.
And and how much longer did your parents live in the Coops after you moved out?
Well, they lived there till my mother died at 71, and then my father moved. He remarried, and he moved out to out to Brooklyn, near Trump Village.
Oh, wow. Oh, my God.
It wasn't Trump Village. It was another building complex of the same nature.
Sure.
And he lived there with his new wife. And he was used to taking, my mother had diabetes. And my father took care of her and gave her insulin shots and did a lot of stuff around the house, including shopping.
Yeah.
And his first wife was the widow of, what was her husband, a butcher or something? So she was very, the Yiddish word is balabuster. She took care of the house. And my father used to go shopping with her, and he used to drive her crazy because he would go and say, look, I can get this for 11 cents. You're paying 12. So he used to complain to me, have you stopped? So this is the kind of, and the other thing that happened is that my brother and I got married, and my father, by that time, he had been an operator, dress operator, and then he owned a store, but he couldn't keep it up because my mother got sick, and he couldn't handle it alone. So he sold it. And to the drummer who married the drum major.
The drum major, yeah.
And then when this woman, his first wife eventually died. The second wife died. She had a stroke. So then he married a third woman, and he kept his apartment. And he found out this when he went to meet this woman, she cooked him a good meal, and he went to look in her drug, to see what drugs she's taken, but she had hidden them under the bed. So he didn't know. She wanted someone to sleep with her, so in case she got a heart attack. But that's the kind of stuff that after she died, he started to lose a little of his mental capacity, and he would start to imagine she was looking in the window at him. So we finally got him into a place up in the Bronx. I can't remember that name. Oh my God. Anyway, when my brother and I drove him up for the interview, we told him, when this woman interviews you, remember President Bush. I think it was George Bush. President Bush? No, we said President Bush. What happened was my brother and I are sitting in the back. He's sitting in front of this woman that's interviewing, and all of a sudden, he gets it together. He was a womanizer.
Yeah.
He really convinced her he was okay, so she admitted him.
President Porsche, I like that.
There's a lot of, in my life, I've had all these funny things. So that was, and then there's a lot of other stories, but he liked to count money because he had a business. He always wanted to be a businessman. My brother used to bring a camera with him. My brother was always very good with all kinds of fiction stuff. And he would give my father a certain amount of money to count, and my father would count it fast, and he would take a picture of it week after week. As my father lost his senses, sort of, he started to count it slower and slower. And my brother always said, Paul, if we play those films backward, it'll be a remarkable cure. I said, the sense of humor is in the family,
Yeah. That's good. That's the only way to survive sometimes.
But that's the kind of, that's the kind of experiences that I had all through my life.
Sure.
Oh, other thing I wanted to say is after my father had to sell a business, he had to go back to work, and he got a job as a pattern maker. He was very skilled. He had become very skilled with the sewing machines and so. And once he had 2 daughters-in-law, his big pleasure, he was working, I think it was Allison Ayres, some sports clothes manufacturer. He would bring home stuff to make dresses for his daughters-in-law.
Oh, wow.
It made him so happy, really happy, that he could do this for both of his daughters-in-law.
Yeah.
He had a lot of happy experiences in my life.
Sure.
And I owe it all to the Coops.
Well, that's a good segue to my final question, which is really the largest question. What from the Coops specifically, or the Bronx more generally, did you carry forward in your life afterwards?
I would say my openness. My wife was a big speaker. She was a big organizer. And I thought, I better not talk so much, because there had instances where she'd be speaking at something and I would talk to someone, and they would then say, Doris told you to say that. And they would talk to other people, and then it would come back to her. She was supposed to have said something that I said. So I learned to shut up when we were in company. When she died, I found out that, as my daughter says, I have a gift for gab. That's because I was throttled so much. 40 years I couldn't speak. I didn't have any freedom of speech. But that's the thing. I'm willing to talk to a lot of people, and I've had a lot of experiences. And I think starting off in the Bronx, when I had all these friends, and I had different people that I knew, that I didn't know, and that I played with, and they've passed on, but I remember stories about all of them, the ones I was closest to, the ones I'm not so close to. But I did have a lot of Bronx friends, including Mo When you see a nicknamed Chicago, who was the only kid that was a Chicago Cubs fan in the Bronx during the 30s and 40s and up till they won the World Series.
That's dedication.
Yankee, a Giant, a Dodger, but nobody else was a Chicago Cubs fan. It opened my eyes to the world. Oh boy.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, one of the things, Alan Alda's wife wrote a book about the kids from the Bronx from 1927 on,
That's right.
different people. And I remember, reading it. I could still read back then. I said, oh, they had all these different people from the Bronx, the Grass Tyson, the guy from the planetarium. You had all these different people as time went by. So that, now that when you ask me about what do I know from the Bronx, part of it is that. One of the people that I became sort of friends with was Milton Glaser, the guy that
Sure.
invented I Heart New York,
Yeah.
right near the Coops, and he used to hang around with us.
Wow.
And I knew him and some other people from his gallery, so I knew him sort of. And there were a lot of other people that I don't have time to remember all of them now. So I'm very proud that they built the Coops in the Bronx.
Absolutely, absolutely. I was reading a book the other day, and it said the person who wrote it is clearly not from New York because it said the Coops were in Queens, and I said, "Are you kidding me?" Oh boy.
Well, that's the way it goes. I mean,
Yeah, I know. That's fine. I mean,
we're in a position to really hear all this stuff.
it's true. And I wish I could have spoken with your wife when she was alive, because I'm sure she had a lot to say about the Bronx as well.
Oh yeah, oh definitely. She was at once before I ever met her. There was a young Hadassah that she became the head of in the Bronx, and they recruited more people because my wife had this remarkable ability. When people came and signed up, she would remember their names. So the next time they came, she said, hello, hello. She knew their name and she would remember whatever they had told her. When we were married and we used to walk together somewhere, she was short, so people always remember her. And they say, hello, Doris. And she would say, hello, John, hello, Jim, whatever. But if she didn't, I said, oh, she can't remember their names. Otherwise, she would have introduced me. And then she would ask him, how's your kids? Are they good in second grade, fifth grade? But she had a remarkable memory.
Wow.
And one of the people I remembered, the Postmaster General under FDR was a guy named James Farley, who also had a remarkable memory for faces and names. And that's why she was so successful as an organizer, because she would remember everybody that she came across.
Sure.
So that was a gift, that I watched. It was amazing. When we moved into this co-op, she got to know everybody. For 30 years, she was on the board of directors of this co-op, and she knew everybody.
Wow.
And they still come to her, all the time. And later on, when my daughter, who looks a little bit like her, would walk with me, people would come over and say, I remember your mother, and she fixed a ticket for me. I said, what? She never told me.
Wow.
The different parts of my life, had a lot of different memories.
Yeah. Do you
So,
remember her ever mentioning much about some of the early civil rights events in the Bronx? Because I've seen her name associated with a couple, like in the late 40s or so. She evidently helped organize some anti-discrimination protest.
no, I didn't know her then, but she
Sure.
at Parkchester, I think.
Yeah, Parkchester. A&P Grocery. There was a protest against A&P Grocery.
Well, Doris Koppelman was her maiden name.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so she did a lot of stuff, you know. She had a lot of tremendous amount of energy.
Yeah.
I remember, you know, this woman, when I got introduced, I said, you know, I didn't realize how energetic she was.
Keep you on your toes, huh?
Yeah. Well, I said, you know, I grew up with a mother who was a premature feminist. I
Yeah.
said, it's true, you're going to do everything faster than they cook, do this, but I have to have some establishment where I wash the dishes.
Yeah.
You know, your meetings earlier.
Oh,
It was a lot of fun, you know. It was a great 40 years.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Uh, Pete, I think we've covered all the questions I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
So unless you have anything else to add, I don't want to keep you.
I could add forever, but I don't want to do that.
Well, I really appreciate you speaking with your friends and getting information from them as well, and sharing what you could. And it's been a pleasure learning about everything that you shared. So,
Right.
so
Yeah,
thank you so much.
you're welcome. You're more than welcome. Because I was a big historian. I did
Absolutely.
a master's in American history, a PhD in African history.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you went to Ghana for research for that, is that right?
For my dissertation, I went to Ghana.
Are you ending?
Yes, just
Okay.
about, just about. Was it bringing back all kinds of memories?
Oh, okay.
Oh, well, thank you again. And
Oh.
thanks for helping set this up, Beth, by the way.
Oh, no problem. Anytime.